Hi, I'm Dr. Andrew Huberman. I want you to enjoy your life. If you truly want a positive change in your life, don't just listen, take action. Like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you can receive more inspiring messages. Today, we're diving into a profound psychological dynamic. What happens when a super empath confronts a narcissist, not with anger, but with clarity, boundaries, and nervous system control. Let's unpack the 5 neuropsychological keys that explain how an empath can quite literally rewire the power dynamics and leave the narcissist exposed, not through revenge, but through regulation. The nervous system is the command center of the human body. It regulates how we perceive threat, how we respond to stress, and ultimately how we maintain control over our internal world in chaotic environments. A super empath has, often through trauma, learned to regulate their nervous system to such a degree that it becomes a psychological fortress. This regulation is not accidental. It's a result of intense self-awareness, emotional pattern recognition, in the deliberate practice of tools like breathwork, mindfulness, and somatic tracking. While the average empath might be flooded by emotional cues from others, absorbing their moods and losing their sense of self, the super empath has developed the ability to observe emotional energy without becoming entangled in it. This creates a profound shift in power dynamics, especially when interacting with a narcissist. Narcissists are wired to seek control. Their nervous systems often operate in a state of hypervigilance, scanning for validation, dominance, and emotional supply. They poke and provoke, often unconsciously, to spark a reaction that reinforces their perceived superiority. This is where most people collapse under pressure, reacting emotionally, defending themselves, or falling into patterns of people-pleasing. The super empath does none of that. They remain still, grounded, and curious. That stillness is not passive. It's a neurobiological signal of power. The empath's heart rate stays steady, their breath remains deep and slow, their voice is calm and unwavering. They activate the parasympathetic nervous system in real time, sending a clear signal, I am not afraid of you. This deeply unsettles the narcissist, whose behavior is built around baiting emotional chaos. When their attempts at control are met with neutrality, the narcissist experiences something called limbic friction. Their own stress hormones begin to rise because they're not receiving the expected feedback loop of emotional dominance. The super empath's nervous system, now functioning like a fortress, disrupts this loop entirely. They no longer enter the fight or flight state that narcissists depend on. Instead, they stay in what neuroscience refers to as the window of tolerance, the optimal zone for rational thought, emotional clarity, and strategic response. In this state, the super empath can observe everything, the manipulative tactics, the gaslighting attempts, the blame shifting, all with clinical detachment. The true power of this lies in the fact that it's invisible. To an outsider, it might seem like the empath is simply being polite or calm, but internally, they're using advanced neurological regulation to dismantle a toxic dynamic. They are not reacting because they are not triggered. They are not triggered because they've trained their nervous system to recognize that the narcissist's chaos is not their responsibility. Over time, this emotional neutrality rewires the empath's brain away from codependency and toward autonomy. The narcissist, now faced with someone they can no longer manipulate, begins to flail emotionally. And it's not because the empath fought back with anger, it's because they didn't fight at all. Empaths are deeply attuned to the emotional states of others. Their brains are highly responsive to subtle changes in tone, body language, and facial expression, largely due to the activation of mirror neurons, specialized brain cells that allow us to empathize by internally replicating what we see in someone else. For most empaths, this means they can feel what others feel, sometimes even more intensely than the person experiencing the emotion themselves. However, a super empath takes this one step further. They don't just feel, they understand. They've developed the capacity to observe emotional behavior while maintaining emotional sovereignty. This ability to mirror without absorption becomes a sharp psychological tool in their interaction with narcissists. Narcissists, in contrast, are performers. Their sense of self is fragile and heavily dependent on external validation. They construct elaborate facades, identities built on charm, control, and charisma. But these performances are not sustainable without a willing audience. They rely on emotional feedback, praise, or conflict to feel real. In the presence of most people, especially emotionally sensitive individuals, narcissists thrive because their performance elicits strong reactions. However, when a super empath enters the equation, something unexpected happens. The performance falls flat. The empath sees through the act, not because they're cynical, but because they're neurologically designed to recognize authentic emotional states, and the narcissist's exaggerated displays simply don't register as real. And this creates an unnerving experience for the narcissist. They are used to manipulating the emotional landscape, but the super empath is not giving them what they expect. Instead of reacting with admiration, fear, or defensiveness, the empath mirrors calmly, offering neutral reflection rather than emotional entanglement. In neuroscience, this triggers dissonance. The narcissist brain expects a certain cause-effect relationship. I act out, therefore you respond. But now that loop is broken. The empath is holding up a mirror, and the narcissist is being forced to see their own behavior for what it is without the usual buffer of emotional distortion. Over time, this mirroring becomes intolerable for the narcissist. Their mask begins to crack under the pressure of quiet observation. They feel exposed, not through confrontation, but through the steady presence of someone who sees clearly without reacting. The super empath doesn't need to call out the narcissist. They simply need to be. Their ability to reflect truth without attachment becomes a psychological disruptor. And because narcissism often avoids self-awareness at all costs, being seen so clearly feels threatening. It's not aggression that breaks the illusion, it's transparency. The empath holds space with precision, offering neither judgment nor admiration, just pure energetic reflection. This causes the narcissist to spiral internally, questioning their own effectiveness, power, and control. What makes this dynamic so powerful is its subtlety. There are no loud arguments or dramatic confrontations. Instead, there is a quiet unraveling. The narcissist is being forced to watch themselves in real time. And the longer they are around the super empath, the more they are confronted with a truth they've spent their entire lives avoiding. And that truth is no longer hidden. It's being mirrored back without distortion. Silence is often misunderstood as weakness or passivity, especially in emotionally charged relationships. But from a neurobiological and psychological perspective, silence can be a powerful strategic tool, particularly in the hands of a super empath. In the context of a relationship with a narcissist, silence functions not as avoidance, but as a form of control and self-mastery. The super empath understands that words are energy and emotional reactions are currency. Narcissists crave this currency. They feed off emotional engagement, whether positive or negative. Silence then becomes a form of starvation, a deliberate refusal to participate in the narcissist's performance, manipulation, or drama. Neuroscience reveals that when silence is introduced into an emotionally stimulating environment, the brain's default mode network is activated. This is the network responsible for introspection, memory recall, and self-reflection. For emotionally healthy individuals, this can be enlightening. For narcissists, however, who often avoid inner reflection due to the fragility of their ego, this silence becomes the trigger. When a super empath withholds verbal reactions, especially in moments designed to provoke, it creates a cognitive void. The narcissist is expecting an argument, a defense, an emotional breakdown, anything that reaffirms their control over the emotional narrative. Instead, they're met with composed silence, and that silence reflects something they cannot tolerate, the absence of validation. Without validation, the narcissist begins to feel invisible, irrelevant, and powerless. This creates internal agitation, leading them to escalate their behavior in an attempt to break the empath's composure. But the super empath, grounded in emotional regulation, does not flinch. They've trained their nervous system not to react automatically, but to respond intentionally. And in these moments, their response is to say nothing. The brilliance of silence lies in its ambiguity. The narcissist cannot predict what the empath is thinking or feeling, and this unpredictability makes them feel unsafe. They are used to pulling emotional strings and getting predictable responses. But when those strings lead to nothing but stillness, the illusion of control begins to collapse. The super empath has not just gone quiet, they've taken the high ground. Their silence becomes louder than any argument, more confronting than any accusation, and more damaging to the narcissist's ego than any insult ever could be. Boundary setting is often misunderstood as a form of rejection or hostility, but in reality, it is one of the most powerful demonstrations of self-awareness and emotional maturity a person can exhibit, especially for a super empath. For much of their lives, Empaths tend to absorb the needs, feelings, and expectations of others. They stretch themselves emotionally, mentally, and even physically to accommodate people around them, particularly those with narcissistic traits. But something transformational happens when a super empath emerges from this pattern. They begin to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are filters that determine what is allowed into their inner world and what is kept out. The moment a super empath sets a firm boundary, they shift from being emotionally reactive to being intentionally selective. And in a relationship with a narcissist, this is nothing short of revolutionary. Narcissists depend on porous boundaries to maintain control. Their tactics, manipulation, gaslighting, blame shifting, work best on individuals who cannot say no, who doubt their own instincts, or who feel guilty for asserting themselves. But when a super empath calmly and clearly states, "This is not acceptable," or "I'm not available for this conversation," they are doing more than protecting themselves. They are disrupting a dysfunctional power structure. Neuroscience shows that boundary setting activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational thought, decision-making, and impulse control. This is the opposite of what narcissists attempt to provoke, which is emotional overwhelm governed by the amygdala and limbic system. When the super empath chooses boundaries over emotional reaction, they maintain control of their mental and emotional faculties. This controlled stance is deeply unsettling to the narcissist. They are accustomed to empaths who bend, apologize, over-explain, and negotiate their own worth in order to maintain peace. But a super empath no longer confuses harmony with self-sacrifice. They have learned that being kind does not mean being compliant. When they say no, they say it without emotional leakage, no guilt, no justification, no invitation for negotiation. The narcissist perceives this as a loss of grip, because every boundary denies them access to control the empath's inner world. Each time a boundary is enforced, the narcissist faces a mirror that shows them they are no longer in charge. This empowerment process is not loud or aggressive. It doesn't involve shouting or ultimatums. In fact, it often feels calm, resolute, and final. The super empath doesn't need to fight to be heard. They simply refuse to participate in dynamics that violate their peace. This sends a clear neurological and energetic message: I choose me. Over time, these boundaries become habits, and those habits, the empath evolves from someone who absorbed toxicity to someone who neutralizes it through presence and principle. What once felt like an act of defiance now feels like alignment. And while the narcissist scrambles to regain control, the super empath stands firmly rooted in their own values, knowing that true connection cannot exist without respect, and respect begins with the boundaries we set for ourselves. Detachment is not indifference, and it is certainly not cruelty, it is clarity. For the super empath, detachment is the culmination of every emotional lesson, every painful realization, and every boundary built in the aftermath of emotional entanglement. It is the moment they stop trying to fix, understand, or rescue the narcissist and instead reclaim their own energy and focus. Narcissists rely on emotional dependency to maintain control. They thrive when someone is deeply invested in them, especially someone who consistently tries to reach their hidden vulnerable core. But the super empath reaches a point of understanding that the narcissist's behavior is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a pattern to be recognized and stepped away from. This realization is what initiates detachment, and for the narcissist, it feels like abandonment, rejection, and betrayal all rolled into one. Psychologically, detachment is a high-functioning state. It is the shift from the emotional brain, where reactivity and codependency thrive, into the rational, grounded awareness of the prefrontal cortex. The super empath no longer chases closure, explanations, or apologies. They accept what is and choose peace over chaos. This decision, though invisible from the outside, represents a complete neurological rewiring. The old triggers lose their charge. The need to explain, defend, or justify fades. The empath no longer lives in the hope that the narcissist will change. Instead, they live in the truth of their own self-worth. The narcissist, who once held power through emotional entanglement, finds themselves grasping at nothing. There is no argument to be won, no breakdown to exploit, no guilt to leverage. The empath is simply gone. Emotionally, energetically, psychologically. What makes detachment so impactful is that it doesn't announce itself. There is no dramatic confrontation or farewell speech. The super empath just stops feeding the connection. They stop responding to manipulation. They stop internalizing blame. They stop showing up to battles that no longer serve them. This silence and absence become deafening to the narcissist, who is used to chaos, reaction, and pursuit. That detachment creates a vacuum, a space the narcissist cannot fill, because they have no real emotional tools beyond control and performance. Suddenly, their tactics don't work. The empath is no longer an audience member to the show. This loss of control causes a deep narcissistic injury, and many narcissists will attempt a final barrage of manipulation, love bombing, gaslighting, playing the victim in a last-ditch effort to reattach the empath emotionally. But the super empath sees through it all, not with bitterness, but with calm understanding. They no longer feel the urge to re-engage. Their nervous system remains regulated, their heart remains steady, and their decisions remain firm. The power dynamic has reversed, not through confrontation, but through elevation. Detachment is the empath's final act of liberation. It is not cold, it is conscious. It marks the end of emotional enslavement and the beginning of sovereign selfhood. The narcissist is left with their own emptiness, forced to face the silence the empath leaves behind, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of exhausting the very supply they once depended on. In the end, the journey of the super empath is not about vengeance or retaliation. It's about transcendence, the transformation from a deeply reactive, emotionally attuned individual into someone who possesses profound inner strength, psychological clarity, and unshakable self-respect is the real triumph. What begins as pain evolves into wisdom, and what was once confusion becomes discernment. Super empath does not seek to harm the narcissist, but instead dismantles the illusion of their power by refusing to play the game. Through nervous system regulation, mirroring without absorption, strategic silence, firm boundaries, and emotional detachment, the empath becomes a force that narcissists cannot manipulate or control. This power isn't loud, aggressive, or even visible to the untrained eye. It is subtle, internal, and immensely potent. The narcissist is left disoriented, not because they were attacked, but because they were seen clearly and then removed from the empath's reality altogether. That removal is the ultimate shift. It rewrites the entire script. What was once a painful dynamic becomes a quiet, powerful declaration: you no longer have access to me. And that, in the world of psychological warfare, is the most devastating blow of all. If this message empowered you, don't forget to like, share, and spread the strength. Subscribe for more truth, transformation, and emotional mastery.